Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Gilliland. For those who are just joining us, I'm the chair of the CGAUX Marketing Subcommittee. Thank you for being with us to discuss one of my favorite topics, ordinary marlin spike. We have a presentation today by our friend JD. I'm going to turn things over to Bruce Johnson, our Coast Guard Auxiliary Liaison, to share what we have planned.
Thanks very much, Josh. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Coast Guard Tech Talks workshop. These workshops are jointly sponsored by the U.S. Coast Guard, the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and the Boy Scouts of America's Sea Scout program. My name is Bruce Johnson, and I serve as the chief of the Coast Guard Auxiliary's youth programs. As you've already met Josh Gilliland, who's chair of the National Sea Scout Communications and Marketing team. Josh will be coordinating your questions in the second part of the program. Coast Guard Tech Talks are held on the fourth Tuesday of the month at 2100 Eastern, 2000 Central, 1900 Mountain, and 1800 Pacific time. Each program focuses on a single science, technology, engineering, mathematics, or STEM topic. These topics are chosen to support the Sea Scout Advancement Program. Next month's AUX Scout workshop will be on how to host a safety at sea event and will be held on Tuesday, November 16th at 2100 Eastern. Tonight's topic is Ordinary Marlin Spike Requirement 6A, Lines, Material, and Knot Loads. Lieutenant J.D. DeCastro will be presenting from the ready room of the Coast Guard Air Station, Atlantic City, New Jersey. As a reminder, we've muted your microphones to make it easier for everyone to hear. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box or the chat box. We'll be monitoring both, and we'll be sure to leave time to answer your questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, let us welcome JD DeCastro.
Good evening, Scouts. Welcome to this week's Tech Talk. We're going to be talking all about lines, getting into the different types, how they actually work from a mathematical perspective, working loads, breaking strengths, the effects of knots and splices on them, and how to care for lines in general. They are a much underappreciated aspect of the environment we operate in, and they do a lot for us. So, let's get into it.
All right, so we're going to start with the things that make up different types of used to characterize a line. That's going to be the material, the weave pattern, and the size. So let's look at the material first. We have two types of materials that we commonly work with. We have natural and we have synthetic. What you see in front of you are two different types of natural lines. The one on the left is manila, the one on the right is cotton. Just as the name entails, these are made out of natural materials that you can find in nature. Hence that's stupid. All right, starting over. 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. All right, so types of lines. There are different things in which we can use to characterize the type of line. It's going to be the material, the weave pattern, and the circumference. We're going to look at material first. So the lines that you see in front of you are going to be natural lines. The one on the left is manila, the one on the right is cotton. Materials that we can use for natural lines are manila, sisal, hemp, and cotton. These lines are typically used when we don't care about strength and we just want the line to do, I don't know, tying down a fender, securing loose gear, or fancy work. So not only do they tend to have a lower breaking strength than synthetic lines, they also don't recover as well after stretching. So their elasticity is very bad. And most importantly, in my opinion, they rot. Since they're made out of natural fibers, if they're not dried, if they're not stored in appropriate places, they will rot, and they will rot quickly. And a rotted line is even less strong than a non-rotted line. So rot is bad. So the next type we have is going to be synthetic. Synthetic lines are man-made. They're typically some type of polymer or plastic. And the most common two that we see are going to be your nylon and your polypropylene. You also have some fancy ones like Dacron and Kevlar. However, those are a little less common and tend to be a little more expensive. The most ones that I see are your double braided nylon, which are going to be on the left, and then the polypropylene, which is going to be on the right. Synthetic lines, they have typically can hold stronger loads, better elasticity, better elongation. However, they do have some shortfalls, which we'll get into later. So the next is going to be weave pattern. So there are two main there are many different types of weave patterns, but the two I'm going to focus on mainly are going to be your triple braid and your double braided nylon. So for the triple braid, how the line is actually constructed are you have a whole bunch of filaments or base elements kind of right down there on the bottom right, which is your tiny string. You take a whole bunch of those, you weave them into a bigger string or a single ply yarn. You take a whole bunch of those and then you weave them into a bigger fiber or a bigger strand. You take that strand, you keep weaving it to make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And the same principle here is just like if you were to take one stick. One stick is weak. If you take a whole bunch of them and make a big bundle of them, it's a lot stronger. The same principle here with rope. You're starting out with something very small, you're weaving it and weaving it and braiding it and braiding it to make the actual big line. And that's going to be your triple braid. So you have 3 of those big strands which are wrapped around each other to form the actual line. The next is going to be your double braided. The double braided consists of a core with a sleeve around it. And these are also very common types of line. Okay, and before we get to the next slide, the last thing in which we use to characterize line is going to be the size. And by size, I'm talking about circumference. So that's how we measure lines. We have small stuff, which is 1.5 inches and under, or less than 1.5 inches. You have a line, which is going to be 1.5 to 5 inches, and then anything over 5 inches in circumference is going to be considered a hawser. Okay, now what this next page or this table is it kind of goes into comparing and contrasting some of the different characteristics of your natural lines and your synthetic lines. So some of the things which we have strength, weight, elongation, effects of moisture, degradation, thermal properties, and then abrasion resistance. So there's a lot that goes into line and line strength. For example, wetness. If a line gets wet, its strength is going to change, which is very applicable for the environment we're working in, because how often does your tow rope or your towing line remain dry? In fact, it doesn't. You want it to be in the water, and so it can actually cool off the rope and prevent internal abrasions and failure. So we need to know, okay, how is the working strength of my line going to change if it gets wet? Very good question. Your natural lines, they actually get stronger when they get wet. So if you look at the top of that chart there, manila can be up to 120% stronger when it's wet. Whereas your synthetics are either slightly less or remain about the same. When we're talking about weight, we're mainly concerned here is whether or not the line floats, what the specific gravity is. So you'll see here pretty much every single line has a specific gravity higher than 1, minus your polypropylene and your polyethylene. What are those types of lines? Think of a ski rope. Those are going to float. They're very plasticky feeling. You just touch them and you feel like you're touching plastic, not so much another type of material. They're also very slippery and very slick. Those lines are more important if we're doing something back by a propeller and we don't want the line to sink and have an opportunity for it to get wrapped around the shaft. we want that line to float up on the water. So throwing lines, heaving lines, certain parts of your tow lines, things like that. And there's a lot that goes into how a line actually behaves. Okay, so from here we're going to get into some different things which can distort or destroy your line. One is going to be a kink. If you have a kink in your line, as you can see here, the load path through the fibers of the line are not going to be consistent. They're going to have to change direction. So a rope is different than most materials. A rope or a line can only withstand load and tension. It cannot be compressed. So anytime that load goes through the line, if it changes a direction, it's going to significantly reduce the amount of load that can actually be transferred by those fibers. Because at some point you're putting one of those fibers in compression, which it does not like and it cannot withstand and is not designed to withstand. So that's why it's very important to not have a kink in your line and to check your lines for kinks prior to actually putting load onto it. And down here we can see some working loads of the actual lines. So this table is taken from the old boat crew seamanship manual, which is no longer applicable. However, if you're interested in getting a copy, a quick Google search and it is everywhere. However, that being said, I wouldn't rely specifically on this chart when you buy a new line. Make sure that you consult the manufacturing data because that will be far more accurate than this page right here. So this is more so reference so you can compare and contrast the differences in breaking strength and working load of a line. And let's dig into those terms some more. So breaking, what do I mean by breaking strength and working load? So breaking strength is the force in which it will take to actually snap a line, part it, break it, destroy it, however you want to view it. And we don't want our working load to be at the same level as our breaking strength for numerous reasons. One, once you get up to about 75% of your breaking strength, you're going to you can permanently deform and weaken that line. So your internal fibers of the line tend to carry the majority of the load inside of a line instead of your external ones. So when you get close to that breaking strength, those internal fibers can actually be destroyed, imparted, and you're not even going to notice. However, now your working load limit of the line and your breaking strength the next time you go to use it is going to be decreased. Furthermore, anytime you put a knot or a splice in a line, that's going to decrease the amount that line can take. So if you're operating a line, say you have a 1-inch double braided nylon rope or line, and you know, okay, it can withstand 20,250 pounds. All right, sweet. I'm gonna tie my boat to the dock with it and use it to pivot upon so I can suck my boat up into the dock while I'm mooring up. Okay, I know my engines produce about 20,000 pounds worth of thrust. This is a very hypothetical scenario. Oh crap, okay, I probably don't want to do that because if I know my braking strength is only 250 pounds more than that, well, I have an I-splice in that mooring line, now it's going to part. Or a more realistic scenario, if I use a 5 3/8 line as a towing line to tow a boat behind me, that boat catches a wave. Now that line is going to far exceed that 9,000 pound limit and I just broke tow. More so when you're working with lines, particularly your synthetic lines, they stretch. When that line stretches before it parts, it's like a rubber band. You pull a rubber band and then it's going to snap and that line is going to come flying back, which can cause injury. So it's very important to know the difference or what your braking strength is and then reduce your working load limit to an appropriate level. For example, the 5/8 double braided nylon line has a working or braking strength of 9,000 pounds. If it's a good line, sweet, your working limit is now 3,000 pounds. A significant difference. And this is also going to help protect you against shock loading of lines. Lines, particularly synthetic lines, are very good in their nature against mitigating shock loading. And what do I mean by shock loading? If I were to take a hammer and pound a tabletop with it, that's going to be shock loading. The more that line is able to stretch is going to lengthen the distance in which that force is applied, thus reducing the actual impact load or the shock to it. So if I apply a force over a longer distance, it's not going to impart as much stress or strain onto whatever it is being imparted on. That's why one of the advantages of using synthetic lines, they stretch to allow the line to actually absorb the load, minimizing the amount that the load's going to affect the line. So here is some examples of how much of the breaking strength is actually going to be lost when you do a knot or a splice. So square knot, you're going to lose about 40%, 46% of the breaking strength. A bowline, you'll only lose 37%. The big thing here is knowing anytime that I put a knot or a splice into a line, that is now my weak point of that line and is most likely where it's going to break. Which is another reason why note that this is breaking strength. Another reason to have the working load limit well below the breaking strength. So you don't necessarily need to get caught around the axles of, okay, what knot am I using? How much of the breaking strength is going to be reduced? Is it still within a limit of what I need or don't need? And another interesting thing to note is splices reduce less of the breaking strength than a knot. So if you know you're doing something which is permanent, take the time, put a splice in it, do an eye splice instead of just sitting with a bowline. Now that's not going to work if you're going to constantly need to be adjusting the length of the line. Yes, put the bowline in it. Don't re-splice the line every single time you need to adjust it. But if you know you have an application for a line, like a towing pennant, put a splice in it. And now here's an example of an actual bowline. And if we'll bring our attention to the far right, where we have a whole bunch of arrows, this is going to illustrate why a knot will reduce the breaking strength of a line. So this bottom red arrow we're going to assume is the load. We'll say we threw a bowline in it to put around a cleat to temporarily moor the boat. As the environmentals are pushing our boat off the dock is going to be illustrated by this bottom red line. It's going to impart some type of load or force. That force is then going to be transmitted through the actual loop of the bowline through these yellowish arrows up to the actual knot. Now when you get to the knot, we have to keep in mind that rope can only withstand a force in tension. So that force is going to have to operate or go through this massive bundle, turns, twist of a line to go back up to that red arrow where it's once again in clean tension. Every single time you see a line take a bend or a turn, one wrapped around another one, you are changing the direction that load has to travel and you are imparting a stress riser into the actual line itself, thus reducing the amount of load that it can actually take. Now this is necessary. There's no way to get around it using a line. However, it just illustrates why the breaking strength of a line is lost every time it goes through a knot.
All right, let's talk about a few other things regarding lines. That's going to be the care and maintenance of a line. So anytime before we use a line, we want to inspect it. We're going to look for signs of aging. How bright is that line? If you take a new line next to a line that's been out in the sun or that's been old, you'll be able to clearly and distinctly see. The new line tends to be very white, very bright, very vivid colors. An aged line tends to be a lot more brown, gray, dull. That's With your natural lines, aging is going to be far more important than with your synthetics, unless you're talking about polypropylene. Polypropylene degrades very quickly with sunlight. So an aged polypropylene line is not going to fare well. Whereas your nylon lines tend to age a little better, or age doesn't tend to affect them as much. Other things you're going to want to look for kinks, which we talked about a little earlier, chafing. If that line's rubbing up against a bollard or some other part of the dock or a cleat, that chafing can start to wear on and actually break strands of the line. You're going to want to look for fiber damage. Okay, do you have a lot of parted fibers? The more parted fibers you have, the more that line is going to be compromised. Discoloration, in particular with natural lines. Mildew can also get in and discolor synthetic lines. Natural lines, your discoloration is going to be a big indicator of rot, mold, and mildew. And then shock loading or overloading damage. If you look at a line and it's a constant diameter except for one part where it narrows, well, that's a sign that that line was overloaded. That line was stretched beyond its elasticity limit, and it will not be able to return back to its normal state. Also, the more a line is worked and the harder it's worked, it actually becomes hard and stiff, and it's not as bendable or pliable. Other important things with lines are actually how you store them and how you roll them up. So when you roll a double braided line, you actually want to alternate which ways you coil that line up, because if you coil it in the same direction, those fibers are actually going to get very tight in on each other, and it's going to be hard to work. Same with a triple strand line or a triple braid line. You want to typically go in a clockwise fashion. If you go in a counterclockwise fashion, it'll bind those braids up against each other. So if you need to go work it, put a splice in it, it's very hard to get your tool in there to actually break those strands apart. Also, when you store a line, you want to store them dry and in a dark place. With natural lines, you want to be even more careful, because if you store them in a dark location without any airflow, you're asking for mold and mildew damage. Whereas your synthetic lines, keep them out of the sun, keep them dry. And then you also want to keep them washed. If you have a lot of salt intrusion into your lines, if you have a lot of grease, a lot of oil, you can use a 10% mild detergent solution to actually wash and get the dirt, the grime, and the grease off of your lines. So, with that being said, that's going to conclude this talk. We'll open it up for questions. And just remember, do not underappreciate the importance of lines. Care for them, keep them clean, use them appropriately, and you can't go wrong with them.
I have a few questions that came in, and I hope that others in the audience are thinking about questions you'd like to ask. Josh and I will be the guinea pigs for answering these questions. And I know between the two of us, we'll figure out the right answer. I think that JD talked about this, but which is stronger in terms of breaking strength? A line with knots or a line with a splice?
I would say a line with a splice would be stronger.
That is the correct answer. In that chart that JD showed us, an I-splice had a loss of 5 to 10% of the overall breaking strength of the line, but a square knot lost 46% of its breaking strength. So if this is a connection point on your line and it doesn't need to get adjusted, and you have the time and the skills, putting a splice into it is much better than putting a knot into it. Something that JD didn't talk about explicitly, but why don't we use manila line for main sheets?
That's running rigging.
Right.
There would be a lot of wear and tear on the natural fibers, which can do everything from rot to not having the same strength. as synthetic line, and it's not the 19th century anymore. So I would definitely go with synthetic for running rigging.
All of that is true. And Douglas Love mentions that manila will swell.
Yeah.
Another reason is that manila is really hard on the hands. If you're attending a sail with manila sheets, you may rip up your hands as well doing that. Would you ever consider using polypropylene line for main sheets?
No,
And why not?
it's not designed for that. Poly would get ripped up pretty quickly. And I want to say its working elasticity is not great, if I remember correctly.
That's correct. When you stretch it out, it has a tendency to break pretty easily. Now there's a good part to that. When polypro starts to degrade, you start seeing these little fish hooks in it. And when you see that in a polypropylene line, you know it's time to give it a decent burial because it's no longer going to be useful. And for the same reason, you wouldn't use polypropylene for a dock line. That needs to be able to stretch, and you stretch polypropylene more than a few times and the fibers are going to start breaking. Something that some of our scouts will be thinking about, maybe not in your area, Josh, but certainly in mine, at the end of the boating season and you remove the lines from the boat, do you just put them away or what do you do to them?
Well, they're not disposable. And so you winterize them, which can be, again, like if you were doing a day cruise in San Francisco Bay or on the East Coast, you go back in, hose down the lines with fresh water, so that way that you get any salt out of them, hang them over the line so that they can dry, then coil them up. And depending on the kind of vessel that you have, if you have a nice lazarette, they can go and hang on their hook in there, and you close the hatch and it's nice, dry, and you're not going to get mold or any horrible science experiments that way.
And JD mentioned something else to consider. If you've had a line out for the entire season or a good bit of the season, it's not just the seawater that may degrade the line, but there are environmental hazards. You know, we've got air pollution and other stuff in the air, and that gets into the line and it will start kind of abrading the strands in the line. So you want to make sure that you wash it out, not just with fresh water, that will be your last step, but using a mild detergent on it and inspect it very carefully. I know, for example, I've seen dock lines where they've been in use for maybe a little longer than they should have, and they were nice double braided lines when they were new. And after a while, some of that cover on the double braided line starts abrading off, and you see the white center core. And when you start seeing that, you know that, again, that line is really not in good shape and you shouldn't trust it. Let's see, and Douglas is mentioning that nylon is susceptible to UV degradation. That's true in varying degrees of all lines. You don't want to leave things out in the sun. Polypro is especially susceptible to UV degradation. You'll see on polypropylene line that it will start getting lighter. And when the color starts washing out, most polypropylene is either yellow or red. And when the color starts washing out, you know that it's just not trustworthy line anymore. Are there other questions or anything else that anybody would like to bring up at this point?
Here's a fun one for the historians of the group. Where's the best Italian hemp grown for manila lines?
It's not in Italy.
Norway.
In Norway. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of Norway as being the place to get Italian hemp.
It is. So again, the old fun question for when scouts are passing ordinary marlin spike.
These days, most of the lines that you're going to see on most of the boats that we use are going to be synthetic lines. They're more expensive than natural fiber, but they last a lot longer, particularly if you take care of it. So that's the golden watchword. Don't leave line sitting on the dock or on the deck of your boat. When I put my boat to bed, each time I use it, I make sure that all of the line is hung up so that it has good airflow through it, and it's not going to be sitting on the deck. That's not good for the line, and it's also not good for the deck. So, yeah.
While we're on marlin spike trivia, what's the difference between permanent elongation and working elasticity?
Well, I'm going to take a guess at this, Josh, and you're going to tell me that I'm wrong, but permanent elongation, I'm assuming that a line has gotten stretched out and its ability to bounce back to its original shape and diameter has been so degraded that it's stretched out as much as it will. And the other was what? Permanent elasticity?
Working elasticity.
Working, yeah, that's a line's ability to stretch under load. And all line has some ability to stretch. Some line is really designed not to stretch much at all. For example, the sheets typically don't stretch all that much for very good reason. So
you're definitely right on working elasticity.
okay.
You're very, very close with permanent elongation, except it's at the beginning when the line's first used. So after the first load's put on it, it's the amount that it stretches and doesn't go back to its original size. So it doesn't necessarily mean the end of the life cycle, but it's more the beginning of it.
It's very important to appreciate what the line can do and what it can't do. Don't take it beyond its limits. JD was pointing out that don't exceed about 1/3 of the rated load on the line. If you don't do that and you take care of your line, it's likely to last you a good long time.
Absolutely. You need lines for operating a boat, whether it's a painter line or a dock line, standing rigging, running rigging. There's lots of lines that you have on a boat, and they all need care. And with that said, we can dive deeper into the topic of ordinary marlin spike, which we have a ship that's volunteered to cover more in detail. So stay tuned for that. We're working out schedules, and that's going to be a youth-led presentation, and I'm super excited for that one.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this evening. I hope that you got something out of the presentation, and we will have more presentations both from the Coast Guard and from the Sea Scouts, and we will make you better seamen and also clue you into the technology involved in what we do. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful and safe evening. Take care.